I need to tell you about Mark Ellis, not because his story has a happy ending, but because someone needs to document what happened before the files disappear. Mark was a homicide detective in Portland for 11 years before the Whitmore case landed on his desk. And in those 11 years, he developed a reputation for being methodical, patient, and incapable of letting details slide. He was the kind of detective who would spend 3 hours reviewing surveillance footage most people would skip through in 20 minutes. He was the kind of detective who kept physical case files even though everything was digital now, because he said he thought better with paper in his hands. He was good at his job, which is probably why they gave him Sarah Whitmore. Sarah Whitmore was reported missing on October 3rd by her sister Jennifer, who said Sarah had not shown up for their standing Tuesday lunch and was not answering her phone. Jennifer told the responding officer that this was completely unlike her sister, that Sarah was punctual to a fault, that something was wrong. The officer took the report and it sat in the system for 48 hours because Sarah was 32 years old, and there were no signs of foul play, and adults are allowed to disappear for a few days without it becoming a police matter. On October 5th, Jennifer called again, more frantic this time, and the case was escalated. On October 7th, a jogger found Sarah's body in Forest Park, approximately 4 miles from the nearest trail entrance, partially concealed under a pile of leaves and branches. She had been dead for at least 4 days, the medical examiner said later, possibly 5. Mark got the call at 6 in the morning. He drove to the scene, walked the perimeter, took his notes, and photographed everything the crime scene techs had not already documented. Sarah had been posed, her hands folded over her chest, her legs straight, her head tilted slightly to the left as if she were sleeping. There was no blood at the scene. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been killed somewhere else, that the cause of death was asphyxiation, that there were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles suggesting restraint, and that her body had been washed clean before being transported to the park. It was professional work, Mark noted, or at least careful work. Someone had taken their time. The case seemed straightforward enough at first, a homicide investigation with standard procedures to follow. Mark interviewed Jennifer Whitmore, who was devastated but composed enough to provide useful information. Sarah had been a high school teacher, English and creative writing, well-liked by students and colleagues. She lived alone in a small apartment in the Pearl District. She had no enemies that Jennifer knew of, no ex-boyfriends with grudges, no financial troubles, no involvement in anything that might make her a target. She was, by all accounts, a normal person living a normal life until she was not living at all. Mark spent 3 days going through Sarah's life, her phone records, her bank statements, her social media accounts, her email. He interviewed her coworkers, her students, her neighbors, the barista at the coffee shop she visited every morning. No one had noticed anything unusual. No one had seen her with anyone suspicious. No one had any idea why someone would want to hurt her. The investigation was going nowhere, and then Mark got the call from Jennifer Whitmore again. Jennifer said she had been going through Sarah's mail, which had been piling up, and she found something strange. She found a credit card statement showing that Sarah had made purchases on October 5th and October 6th, 2 and 3 days after she had been reported missing, and at least 1 day after she was already dead, according to the medical examiner's timeline. Mark asked Jennifer to bring the statement to the station. When she arrived, he looked at the charges. Coffee at Sarah's usual shop on the morning of October 5th. Groceries at the Safeway near her apartment on the afternoon of October 6th. Gas at a Shell station that same evening. All of it paid for with Sarah's credit card. All of it at locations Sarah frequented. Mark pulled the surveillance footage from all 3 locations. At the coffee shop, he watched Sarah Whitmore walk through the door at 7:43 in the morning on October 5th, order her usual drink, pay with her card, and leave. She was wearing jeans and a green jacket, the same jacket Jennifer said was hanging in Sarah's closet. And she moved normally, casually, like someone getting coffee before work. At the grocery store, he watched her push a cart through the aisles, select items, check out, and load bags into her car. At the gas station, he watched her pump gas into her Honda Civic, the same car that was now parked at her apartment building, and then drive away. In all 3 videos, Sarah looked alive, healthy, calm. Mark sat in the viewing room for a long time after the footage ended, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The medical examiner had been certain about the timeline, Sarah had been dead for at least 4 days when her body was found, which meant she had been dead on October 5th, which meant the woman in the surveillance footage could not have been Sarah Whitmore. But the woman in the footage looked exactly like Sarah, moved like Sarah, used Sarah's credit card and car, went to Sarah's usual places. Mark considered the possibility of a twin, but Jennifer had already told him Sarah was an only child. He considered the possibility of a look-alike, but the resemblance was too perfect, and the look-alike would have needed access to Sarah's card and car and would have needed to know her routines. Mark called the medical examiner and asked her to double-check the timeline. She called him back 2 hours later and said she had reviewed everything again and she was certain Sarah Whitmore had been dead for a minimum of 4 days when her body was found, possibly longer. Mark asked if there was any possibility she was wrong. She said no, the level of decomposition was clear, the insect activity was consistent with the timeline, there was no margin for error. Sarah had been dead on October 5th when someone who looked exactly like her was buying coffee. The case should have been reassigned at that point. The case should have been flagged as a priority and handed over to a task force. But Mark did not know who to tell or what to say, because what he had found did not make sense, and in his experience people did not react well to things that did not make sense. He decided to keep investigating on his own, quietly, and see if he could find an explanation that would hold up under scrutiny. He went back to Sarah's apartment building and spoke to the neighbors again. This time he asked specifically about October 5th and 6th, and this time 3 different people told him they had seen Sarah during those 2 days. The woman in 3B said she had passed Sarah in the hallway on the morning of October 5th, that Sarah had smiled and said good morning just like always. The man in 2C said he had seen Sarah getting into her car in the parking garage on the afternoon of October 6th. The building manager said Sarah had stopped by the office on the morning of October 6th to ask about a maintenance issue with her dishwasher. All of them were certain, all of them described Sarah in detail, all of them said she had seemed perfectly normal. Mark asked the building manager if he could review the security footage from the building. The building had cameras in the hallways, the lobby, the parking garage, and the elevator. Mark watched the footage from October 5th and 6th, and he saw Sarah Whitmore entering and leaving her apartment multiple times, walking through the lobby, riding the elevator, getting into her car. She looked the same in every frame, moved the same way, wore the same clothes he had seen in the other surveillance footage. There was no indication that anything was wrong, no sign that this was anyone other than Sarah Whitmore going about her normal life. Mark went to Sarah's apartment with a warrant. The apartment was neat, organized, lived in. There were dishes in the sink, a load of laundry in the washing machine, a half-finished book on the nightstand. In the kitchen, Mark found the groceries Sarah had purchased on October 6th. Some of them still in the bags, some of them put away in the refrigerator and pantry. The milk had an expiration date a week out. The bananas were still green. Mark opened the dishwasher and found that it was working fine, no maintenance issue at all. He sat down at Sarah's kitchen table and tried to construct a rational explanation for what he had found. He considered the possibility that the medical examiner had made a mistake, but she had been adamant about the timeline and she had no reason to be wrong. He considered the possibility that Sarah had been alive on October 5th and 6th and had been killed afterward, but that would mean the body in the park was not Sarah Whitmore, which made no sense because Jennifer had identified the body and the fingerprints matched and the DNA would match once the lab results came back. He considered the possibility that someone was impersonating Sarah after her death, but that person would have needed to look exactly like her and know everything about her life and have access to her apartment and car and credit cards, and even then it did not explain why they would bother to buy groceries and ask about a dishwasher and go through the motions of Sarah's daily routine. Mark left the apartment without an answer. He drove back to the station and sat at his desk and stared at the case file, and for the first time in his career he had no idea what to do next. He was still sitting there when his lieutenant stopped by and told him there was another case. A missing person named David Chun, reported missing by his husband on October 8th, last seen on October 6th. The lieutenant said it was probably nothing, probably just a guy who needed a few days away, but they were short-staffed and Mark was the only detective available, so could he take it? Mark took it. David Chun was a software engineer at a tech company downtown. He was 38 years old, married for 6 years, no children, no history of disappearing or causing concern. His husband Peter said David had left for work on the morning of October 6th and had not come home that night. Peter had called David's phone repeatedly with no answer. He had called the company and they said David had not shown up for work. He had called David's friends and none of them had heard from him. On October 8th, Peter filed a missing person report. On October 10th, a hiker found David Chen's body in the Columbia River Gorge, wedged between two rocks at the water's edge. He had been dead for at least 3 days, the medical examiner said, possibly 4. Mark stood at the edge of the river and looked at David Chen's body and felt something cold settle in his chest, because he knew what was coming next. He knew what he was going to find when he started investigating, and he was right. David Chen had been posed, his hands folded over his chest, his legs straight, his head tilted slightly to the left. There was no blood at the scene. The medical examiner would later determine that David had been killed somewhere else, that the cause of death was asphyxiation, that there were ligature marks on his wrists and ankles, and that his body had been washed clean before being transported to the gorge. The method was identical to Sarah Whitmore's murder. Mark interviewed Peter Chen, who was devastated and confused and desperately wanted to know what had happened to his husband. Mark asked the standard questions and got the standard answers. David had been a good person, a kind person, he had no enemies, no trouble, no reason for anyone to hurt him. Mark asked Peter if David had any credit cards, and Peter said yes, and Mark asked if Peter could check the statements for any unusual activity after October 6th. Peter called the credit card companies and called Mark back an hour later and said there had been charges on October 7th and 8th and 9th, charges at places David went regularly, his gym, his favorite lunch spot, a bookstore he liked. Mark pulled the surveillance footage and he watched David Chen walk into his gym on the morning of October 7th, work out for 45 minutes, shower, and leave. He watched David Chen order a sandwich at his favorite lunch spot on October 8th. He watched David Chen browse the aisles of a bookstore on October 9th, select 2 books, pay for them with his credit card, and walk out. In every video, David looked alive, healthy, normal. In every video, David was already dead. Mark went to David and Peter's apartment building and spoke to the neighbors. 3 people said they had seen David during the days after October 6th. The woman across the hall said she had run into David in the elevator on October 7th and they had chatted about the weather. The man downstairs said he had seen David in the parking garage on October 8th. The building security guard said David had walked past the desk on October 9th and waved hello. Mark reviewed the building security footage and saw David Chen entering and leaving the building multiple times, walking normally, moving naturally, doing nothing that would suggest anything was wrong. Mark went to David's office with a warrant and spoke to his co-workers. 4 of them said they had seen David at work during the week of October 7th. His cubicle neighbor said David had been at his desk on October 8th working on code. His manager said David had attended a meeting on October 9th. A woman from the lunch break said she had eaten lunch with David in the cafeteria that same day and he had seemed fine, maybe a little quiet, but fine. Mark asked to see the office security footage and the IT logs. The footage showed David at his desk, the logs showed David's computer being accessed, his credentials being used, emails being sent from his account. Everything suggested that David Chen had been alive and working, except that David Chen had been dead in the Columbia River Gorge since October 6th. Mark sat in his car in the office parking lot and tried to breathe normally, tried to think clearly, tried to come up with some explanation that did not involve impossibility. He could not. He drove back to the station and went directly to his lieutenant's office and closed the door and told him everything, the surveillance footage, the witnesses, the credit card charges, the timelines that did not line up. His lieutenant listened without interrupting, and when Mark finished talking, his lieutenant was quiet for a long time, and then he asked Mark if he was okay, if he was sleeping enough, if he was under a lot of stress. Mark said he was fine, he was not imagining things, the evidence was real. His lieutenant said he believed that Mark believed that, but maybe Mark should take a few days off, maybe Mark should talk to someone. Mark did not take a few days off. Mark went back to his desk and pulled the Sarah Whitmore file and the David Chen file and laid them out side by side and looked for connections. Sarah and David had not known each other. They had no mutual friends, no shared interests, no overlap in their lives except for the fact that they had both been murdered and posed and washed clean and left in isolated locations, and they had both been seen alive after they were already dead. Mark made a list of the places both victims had been seen after death. Coffee shops, grocery stores, gas stations, gyms, offices, homes. All of them ordinary places, all of them places the victims had frequented in life. Mark made a list of the witnesses who had seen both victims. Neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, strangers. All of them credible, all of them certain of what they had seen. Mark started checking missing person reports from the past year, looking for similar cases where someone had disappeared and then been seen alive afterward. He found nothing. He expanded his search to surrounding counties, to the entire state, to neighboring states. He found nothing. Sarah Whitmore and David Chen were the only cases that fit the pattern, which meant either the pattern was new or the pattern had been hidden until now. On October 14th, Mark got a call from a patrol officer who said there was a situation at an apartment building on the east side. A woman had called 911 saying her roommate was in the apartment but was not her roommate, that something was wrong, that she needed help. The officer said he had responded to the call and found nothing unusual, but the woman was insistent and the officer thought maybe a detective should follow up. Mark drove to the address and met the woman, whose name was Lisa Huang. Lisa was in her mid-20s, shaking, pale, barely coherent. She said her roommate was named Angela Torres, that Angela had gone missing 4 days ago, that Lisa had filed a police report, and that this morning Angela had come home and walked into the apartment like nothing was wrong. Mark asked where Angela was now. Lisa said she was in her bedroom. Mark asked if he could see her. Lisa nodded and led him down the hallway to a closed door. Mark knocked, and a voice from inside said, "Come in." And Mark opened the door and saw Angela Torres sitting on her bed folding laundry. She looked up at him and smiled and asked if she could help him. Mark introduced himself, showed his badge, and asked Angela where she had been for the past 4 days. Angela looked confused and said she had not been anywhere. She had been here, she had been home. Mark asked if she had left the apartment at all in the past 4 days. Angela said of course she had. She had gone to work, she had run errands, she had lived her normal life. Mark asked why Lisa thought she had been missing. Angela laughed and said Lisa had been acting weird lately. Maybe she was stressed about school. Maybe she was imagining things. Mark excused himself and went back to the living room where Lisa was waiting. He asked Lisa why she thought Angela had been missing. Lisa said because Angela had not been home, because Angela had not answered her phone, because Angela's car had been parked in the same spot for 4 days without moving, because Lisa had checked with Angela's work and they said Angela had not shown up. Mark asked when Angela had left. Lisa said 4 days ago, October 10th, in the evening. Mark asked if Lisa was certain. Lisa said yes, she was certain. She remembered because they had argued about the dishes and Angela had left upset. Mark went to Angela's workplace, a dental office where she worked as a receptionist. The office manager confirmed that Angela had not been at work since October 10th, that she had called in sick on October 11th, that she had not called at all after that the office had been trying to reach her without success. Mark asked if anyone had seen Angela in the past 4 days. The office manager said no, absolutely not, they had been worried about her. Mark pulled Angela's credit card statements and phone records. There had been no activity since October 10th. No charges, no calls, no texts, nothing. Mark pulled the security footage from Angela's apartment building. The footage showed Angela leaving the building on the evening of October 10th and not returning until the morning of October 14th. There was no footage of Angela entering or leaving the building during the 4 days in between. Mark reviewed the footage from October 14th again, watching Angela walk through the lobby, ride the elevator, unlock the apartment door, and go inside. She moved normally, naturally, without hesitation. Mark went back to the apartment and knocked on the door. Angela answered, still smiling, still calm. Mark asked if he could speak with her privately. Angela said sure and invited him in. Mark sat down across from her and asked her directly where she had been for the past 4 days. Angela said she had been home. She had already told him that. Mark said the evidence suggested otherwise. Angela's smile did not change. She said maybe the evidence was wrong. Mark asked if she remembered anything unusual happening on October 10th. Angela said no, nothing unusual, it had been a normal day. Mark asked if she remembered arguing with Lisa about the dishes. Angela said no, she did not remember that. Mark watched Angela's face as she spoke, looking for any sign of deception, any indication that she was lying or confused or frightened. He saw nothing. Angela's expression was calm. Her voice was steady. Her body language was relaxed. She seemed genuinely unbothered by his questions, genuinely unconcerned about the discrepancy between what he was saying and what she believed. Mark asked Angela if she would be willing to come to the station to answer more questions. Angela said she would, but she did not understand why. Mark said it was just routine, just to clear things up. Angela said okay, and she stood up and got her jacket and followed him to his car without protest. At the station, Mark put Angela in an interview room and called the medical examiner. He asked if they could run a full physical exam on someone who might have been dead. The medical examiner asked what he meant, and Mark said he was not sure of anything anymore, but he needed to know if there was a way to tell if someone had been dead and was somehow not dead now. The medical examiner said that did not make sense, that was not how death worked. Mark said he knew that, but could they run the exam anyway? The medical examiner said she would send someone over. While they waited, Mark interviewed Angela again, this time on the record. He asked her to walk him through her activities for the past 4 days, hour by hour. Angela did, describing a normal routine of waking up, eating breakfast, watching television, running small errands, going to bed. Mark asked where she had gone when she ran errands. Angela said nowhere specific, just around the neighborhood. Mark asked if she had used her credit card. Angela said no, she had paid cash. Mark asked if she had used her phone. Angela said not really, she had been taking a break from screens. Mark asked why. Angela said no reason, she just felt like it. The medical examiner's assistant arrived and took Angela to an examination room. Mark waited, going over his notes, trying to find something he had missed. An hour later, the assistant came back and said everything was normal. Angela's vital signs were normal. Her reflexes were normal. Her pupils were responsive. There was no indication of any trauma or illness or abnormality. Mark asked if there was anything unusual at all. The assistant said no. Angela Torres was a healthy 26-year-old woman with no medical concerns. Mark let Angela go home. He drove back to the station and sat at his desk and tried to make sense of what was happening. And he could not. Angela Torres had been missing for 4 days. Her credit cards and phone had been inactive. Her workplace had not seen her. The security footage confirmed she had not been in her apartment. And yet Angela herself had no memory of being gone and showed no signs of anything being wrong. She had simply reappeared, calm and normal, and completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. That night, Mark dreamed about Sarah Whitmore and David Chun and Angela Torres standing in a line. All of them smiling, all of them calm, all of them looking at him with expressions that were pleasant and empty. He woke up at 3 in the morning and could not go back to sleep. He got dressed and drove to the station and started going through missing person reports again, and this time he found what he was looking for. Over the past 6 months, there had been 14 people reported missing in the Portland metro area who had later been confirmed dead. Mark pulled all 14 files and read through them carefully. 9 of the 14 had been found in isolated locations, posed with their hands folded over their chests, their legs straight, their heads tilted slightly to the left. 9 of the 14 had been killed by asphyxiation with ligature marks on their wrists and ankles. 9 of the 14 had been washed clean before being dumped. Mark cross-referenced the dates of the disappearances with credit card records and phone logs and witness statements. In 6 of the 9 cases, there had been activity after the estimated time of death. In 6 of the 9 cases, witnesses had reported seeing the victims alive after they had been killed. In 6 of the 9 cases, the victims had been seen going about their normal routines, visiting familiar places, interacting with people they knew, behaving as if nothing was wrong. Mark made a timeline. The first victim had disappeared in April, the most recent in October. The pattern was accelerating, 1 victim every 3 or 4 weeks at first, then 1 every 2 weeks, then 1 every week. If the pattern continued, there would be another victim soon, possibly within days. Mark updated the case file and wrote a report summarizing his findings and submitted it to his lieutenant, requesting a task force, requesting additional resources, requesting permission to investigate all 9 cases as a connected series. His lieutenant called him into his office the next morning and closed the door and told Mark to sit down. His lieutenant said he had read the report and he had concerns, serious concerns, about Mark's conclusions. He said the evidence Mark had compiled was circumstantial and unreliable, that witness statements could be mistaken, that surveillance footage could be misinterpreted, that credit card charges could have been made by someone other than the victims. He said it was not possible for dead people to be walking around buying groceries and going to work, and any report suggesting otherwise would not be taken seriously. He said Mark needed to take a step back, take some time off, talk to a professional. He said this with concern, not anger, as if he were genuinely worried about Mark's well-being. Mark did not take time off. Mark went back to his desk and kept investigating quietly, alone, because no one else was going to. He started visiting the locations where the victims had been found, walking the areas, looking for anything that might explain the pattern. He visited Forest Park where Sarah Whitmore had been found, the Columbia River Gorge where David Chun had been found, the industrial area where another victim had been found, the abandoned warehouse where another victim had been found. All of them were isolated, all of them were far from main roads, all of them required effort to reach. Someone was choosing these locations deliberately, someone was taking time to transport the bodies and pose them and arrange them, someone was careful and patient and methodical. Mark started visiting the locations where the victims had been seen after death, the coffee shops and grocery stores and offices and gyms. He spoke to employees and managers and asked if anyone had noticed anything unusual about the victims during those sightings. Anything off, anything wrong. Most people said no, the victims had seemed perfectly normal. A few people said maybe the victims had seemed a little distant, a little quiet, not quite themselves, but nothing that had raised any alarm. One barista said Sarah Whitmore had ordered her usual drink but had not added her usual extra shot of espresso, which was strange because Sarah always added the extra shot. One coworker said David Chun had been at his desk but had not participated in the usual morning conversation, had just sat there staring at his screen, which was unlike him because David was usually chatty. Small things easily dismissed, but Mark wrote them all down. On October 20th, a woman named Rachel Kim was reported missing by her boyfriend. On October 23rd, Rachel Kim's body was found in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. She had been posed, asphyxiated, washed clean. On October 21st and 22nd, Rachel Kim had been seen at her apartment, at her workplace, at a restaurant she frequented. She had used her credit card, accessed her computer, spoken to her neighbors. She had appeared calm, normal, alive. Mark drove to Rachel's apartment building and reviewed the security footage himself without asking permission. He watched Rachel Kim enter and leave the building multiple times on October 21st and 22nd, moving with the same calm efficiency he had seen in the other videos. He went to Rachel's workplace and spoke to her co-workers, who confirmed they had seen Rachel during those 2 days, that she had been at her desk, that she had attended meetings, that nothing had seemed wrong. Mark asked if Rachel had behaved any differently than usual. One coworker said Rachel had been quieter than normal, had not laughed at a joke that usually would have made her laugh. Another coworker said Rachel had not eaten lunch with the group like she usually did, had just sat at her desk instead. Mark was standing in the parking lot of Rachel's office building when his phone rang. It was the medical examiner. She said she had been reviewing the autopsy reports from the 9 connected cases and she had found something she had missed before because she had not been looking for it. She said all 9 victims had trace amounts of an unknown substance in their respiratory systems. A substance that did not match anything in the database, something she could not identify. She said it was subtle, easy to overlook, but it was there in all 9 cases, concentrated in the lungs and throat. She asked Mark if he wanted her to send samples to a specialized lab for further analysis. Mark said yes, send them anywhere, do whatever it took to figure out what the substance was. Mark went home that night and tried to sleep and could not. He kept thinking about the victims, about the way they had looked in the surveillance footage, calm and normal and empty. He kept thinking about Angela Torres sitting in her bedroom folding laundry, smiling at him with an expression that was pleasant and distant. He kept thinking about the phrase one of the coworkers had used, not quite themselves, as if the victims were copies of themselves, approximations that were close but not perfect. He got up and went to his computer and started researching, reading about identity disorders and amnesia and dissociative states, trying to find some psychological explanation for what he had seen. He found nothing that fit. He expanded his search, reading about folklore and urban legends and paranormal phenomena, feeling ridiculous but desperate for any framework that might make sense of the evidence. He read about doppelgangers, about skinwalkers, about possession, about beings that could mimic human form. He read until the sun came up, and then he got dressed and drove to the station and kept working. On October 27th, a man named Thomas Park was reported missing. On October 30th, his body was found. On October 28th and 29th, he was seen alive, using his credit card, going to work, speaking to his family. Mark did not wait for the report to be filed. He drove to Thomas's house and spoke to his wife, who was confused and frightened because Thomas had been home yesterday, had been sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast, had kissed her goodbye before leaving for work, and now the police were telling her he had been dead for days. Mark asked if Thomas had seemed different in any way. His wife said maybe a little quiet, maybe a little strange, but she had thought he was just tired. Mark asked what she meant by strange. She said Thomas had not recognized their dog, had looked at the dog like he had never seen it before, had not called it by name. Mark interviewed Thomas's co-workers, his friends, his neighbors. All of them said they had seen Thomas during the days after his disappearance. All of them said Thomas had seemed mostly normal. All of them mentioned small things that had been off. Thomas had not responded to an inside joke at work, had not known where he usually parked his car, had not remembered his favorite lunch order. Small things easily explained away as forgetfulness or distraction, but Mark was starting to see a pattern in the small things, a pattern of gaps in memory, gaps in personality, gaps in identity. The lab results came back on the unknown substance found in the victim's lungs. The substance was organic, the report said, but it did not match any known biological material. It had a complex molecular structure that suggested it might be fungal or bacterial in origin, but it did not fit into any existing taxonomic category. The lab had never seen anything like it. They recommended further testing, further analysis, but they could not say what it was or where it came from or what it did. Mark took the report to his lieutenant again, and again his lieutenant told him to drop it, told him he was wasting resources on a theory that did not make sense, told him to focus on finding the killer using conventional methods. Mark said the conventional methods were not working, that there was something else happening here, something they did not understand. His lieutenant said that was exactly the problem, that Mark was looking for explanations that did not exist, that Mark needed to stay grounded in reality. Mark said he was grounded in reality, that the evidence was real, that the victims were being seen after death, and that had to mean something. His lieutenant said maybe it meant the witnesses were wrong, maybe it meant the medical examiner was wrong, maybe it meant a lot of things, but it did not mean what Mark thought it meant. Mark left the office and sat in his car and realized no one was going to believe him, no one was going to take this seriously, no one was going to investigate the truth because the truth was too strange to accept. He realized he was on his own. He started following the pattern himself, tracking the timeline, predicting when the next victim would disappear. Based on the accelerating frequency, he calculated that the next disappearance would happen within the next few days, somewhere in the Portland metro area, someone with a routine life and no obvious risk factors. He could not protect everyone, could not prevent the next abduction, but he could watch, he could document, he could try to catch whoever or whatever was doing this. On November 2nd, a woman named Michelle Carr was reported missing by her mother. Mark was at the station when the report came in, and he immediately drove to Michelle's apartment. The apartment was empty. No signs of struggle. No signs of forced entry. Everything neat and undisturbed. Mark interviewed the neighbors and learned that Michelle had left for work that morning and had not come home that night. He pulled the security footage from the building and watched Michelle leave at 7:30 in the morning, walking normally, carrying her purse and work bag, getting into her car and driving away. Mark spent the next 2 days monitoring Michelle's credit card activity, her phone location, the security cameras at her workplace, and her usual locations. There was no activity, no charges, no calls, no sightings. Michelle Carr had vanished completely. On November 4th, Mark was sitting in his car outside Michelle's apartment building when he saw her. She walked through the lobby at 8 in the morning, took the elevator up to her floor, unlocked her apartment door, and went inside. Mark sat in his car for 10 minutes, trying to decide what to do, and then he got out and went upstairs and knocked on Michelle's door. Michelle answered, smiling, asking how she could help. Mark showed his badge and said he needed to ask her some questions. Michelle invited him in and offered him coffee, which he declined. Mark asked Michelle where she had been for the past 2 days. Michelle looked confused and said she had been home. She had been here. Mark said her mother had filed a missing person report, that Michelle had not been seen for 2 days. Michelle laughed and said that was silly. Her mother must have been confused. She had been home the whole time. Mark asked if Michelle remembered going to work yesterday. Michelle said yes, of course. She had gone to work just like always. Mark said her workplace had reported that she had not shown up. Michelle said they must have made a mistake. Mark called Michelle's workplace while standing in her apartment. The manager confirmed that Michelle had not been at work for the past 2 days, that they had been trying to reach her without success. Mark put the manager on speaker and asked him to repeat what he had just said. The manager did, sounding annoyed. Mark looked at Michelle and asked her to explain. Michelle's smile did not change. She said she did not understand. She had been to work. Maybe there was some administrative error. Mark asked Michelle to show him her phone. Michelle handed it over without hesitation. Mark checked the call log and text messages. There had been no activity since November 1st. He checked her photos and saw nothing recent. He handed the phone back and asked Michelle if she had any explanation for the gap in her digital footprint. Michelle said maybe her phone had been malfunctioning. Maybe she needed to get it checked. Mark stared at Michelle's car and felt a deep, cold certainty settle into his bones, because he knew Michelle was going to be found dead. He knew her body was already somewhere waiting to be discovered, and yet Michelle was standing in front of him smiling and answering questions and genuinely believing she was alive. He asked Michelle if she would come with him to the station, if she would agree to a medical examination. Michelle said sure, why not, she had nothing to hide. At the station, the medical examiner ran the same tests she had run on Angela Torres, and the results came back normal. Michelle's vital signs were stable. Her reflexes were intact. Her pupils were responsive. There was nothing physically wrong with her except that she should not have been there at all because Michelle's car was dead. Mark was certain of it. And 2 days later his certainty was confirmed when a cyclist found Michelle's body in a drainage ditch off Highway 26. She had been dead for at least 4 days, the medical examiner said, which meant she had been dead when Mark had spoken to her at her apartment. She had been dead when she had smiled at him and invited him in and offered him coffee. Mark stood in the medical examiner's office and looked at Michelle's body on the table, and then he went back to the station and pulled the security footage from Michelle's apartment building and watched the woman who was not Michelle walk through the lobby and take the elevator and unlock the apartment door. He watched the footage over and over, looking for anything that would prove this was an imposter, a twin, a look-alike, anything other than what it appeared to be. He found nothing. The woman in the footage looked exactly like Michelle Carr, moved exactly like Michelle Carr, used Michelle's keys and Michelle's gestures and Michelle's expressions. Mark drove back to Michelle's apartment building and used the master key to enter her unit. The apartment was empty, no sign that anyone had been there recently, but Mark searched anyway, looking through drawers and closets and cabinets, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. In Michelle's bedroom, he found a journal on the nightstand. He opened it and read the last entry, dated October 31st, the day before Michelle had disappeared. The entry was mundane, details about work and plans for the weekend and a movie Michelle wanted to see. At the bottom of the page, Michelle had written something that made Mark's hands shake. She had written, "I keep having this dream where I am not myself, where I am watching myself from outside my body, where someone else is wearing my face," and the handwriting was shaky, uncertain, as if Michelle had been frightened when she wrote it. Mark closed the journal and sat on Michelle's bed and tried to think, tried to find the pattern, tried to understand what connected all of these victims. They had been ordinary people living ordinary lives, no shared acquaintances, no common locations, no obvious risk factors. The only thing that connected them was the manner of their deaths and the fact that they had been seen alive afterward, and the fact that whatever was pretending to be them seemed to believe it was them, seemed to have access to their memories and their routines and their identities. Mark thought about the substance in the victim's lungs, the unknown organic material that did not match anything in the database. He thought about the small gaps in behavior, the forgotten inside jokes, the unrecognized pets, the missing personality quirks. He thought about Michelle's dream, the feeling of watching herself from outside her body, the feeling of someone else wearing her face. He went back to the station and pulled all the case files and spread them out on his desk and looked for anything he had missed. Any detail that might explain how someone was taking these people, how someone was killing them, and how something was taking their place. He looked at the locations where the bodies had been found, all of them isolated, all of them requiring time and effort to reach. He looked at the locations where the victims had been seen afterward, all of them public, all of them places where the victims would normally go. He looked at the timeline, the accelerating pattern, the way the incidents were happening more frequently now, as if whatever was doing this was gaining momentum. Mark's phone rang. It was the medical examiner. She said she had something important, something she needed to show him in person. Mark drove to the medical examiner's office and found her in the lab, standing over a microscope. She said she had been analyzing the unknown substance from the victim's lungs more carefully, using higher magnification, and she had found something the initial analysis had missed. She had found that the substance was not inert, that it was still active, still moving, still behaving like something alive even though it was taken from dead tissue. She invited Mark to look through the microscope. Mark looked, and he saw threads, delicate filaments that pulsed and contracted, that seemed to be searching for something, reaching for something. The medical examiner said the threads appeared to be networked, connected to each other, forming a web-like structure throughout the respiratory system. She said she had never seen anything like it, that it did not behave like any fungus or bacteria or parasite she had ever encountered. She said it looked almost intentional, almost designed, as if it had a purpose. Mark asked what the purpose might be. The medical examiner said she did not know, but based on the location of the substance in the throat and lungs, she hypothesized it might be related to breathing, to respiration, to the act of taking in air and expelling it. She said if the substance was interfering with that process, if it was blocking or altering the way the victims breathed, that might explain the asphyxiation, that might explain how they died. Mark asked if the substance could still be active after death. The medical examiner said it appeared to be, that it was still moving even now, weeks after the victims had died. Mark asked what that meant. The medical examiner said she did not know, she could not explain it, but it meant something. It meant the substance was not just a byproduct of the death. It was an active participant in whatever had happened to these people. Mark thanked her and left and drove back to the station. And on the way he had a thought, a terrible thought. A thought that made him pull over to the side of the road and sit with his hands on the steering wheel trying to breathe. He thought about the substance in the victim's lungs, still active, still moving, still searching. He thought about the victims being seen after death, walking and talking and breathing like living people. He thought about what the medical examiner had said, that the substance might be related to respiration, to the act of breathing. He thought about the possibility that the substance was not killing the victims, that it was animating them, that it was using their respiratory systems to move their bodies, to operate their bodies, to wear their bodies like suits. He thought about Angela Torres smiling at him, about Michelle Carr offering him coffee, about all the victims who had been seen after death going about their routines calmly and normally, and he thought about the possibility that those had not been the victims at all, that those had been something else, something that had taken up residence in the victims' bodies and was learning to be them, learning to move like them, learning to speak like them, learning to breathe. Mark started the car again and drove to the station and went to his desk and pulled up the surveillance footage from all the cases, the videos of the victims walking and moving and interacting with people after they had been killed. He watched them all, one after another, looking for anything unusual in the way they moved, and he found it. He found that they all moved slightly wrong, that their gestures were a fraction too slow or too deliberate, that their expressions changed a beat too late, that they blinked less frequently than normal. He found that they all breathed strangely, their chests rising and falling with a rhythm that was just slightly off, too measured, too regular, as if they were not breathing automatically but concentrating on the act of breathing, remembering to do it. Mark called the medical examiner back and asked her if it would be possible for something to control a dead body, to animate it, to make it move and speak. The medical examiner said no, that was not possible, that once the brain stopped functioning the body stopped working, that there was no mechanism for reanimation. Mark said what if the mechanism was not biological, what if it was something else, what if the substance in the lungs was not just a passive presence but an active intelligence. The medical examiner was quiet for a long time, and then she said that was not her area of expertise, that what Mark was describing was not medicine, that if he wanted to pursue that line of thinking he would need to talk to someone else. Mark did not know who else to talk to, did not know what expert could help him understand what he was seeing. He spent the night at his desk going through the files again, and in the early morning hours he found something he had missed before, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt crucial. In 4 of the cases, witnesses had mentioned that the victims had smelled strange after they had been seen alive. A sweet, earthy smell that was noticeable but not unpleasant. One witness had described it as smelling like dirt after rain. Another witness had described it as smelling like mushrooms. Mark had dismissed these comments before because they seemed irrelevant, but now he wondered if they were describing the substance, if they were describing the smell of whatever was inside the victims, learning to be them. On November 8th, Mark's lieutenant called him into his office and told him he was being placed on administrative leave. The lieutenant said Mark had become obsessed with the case, that he was pursuing theories that had no basis in reality, that his behavior was concerning his colleagues. Mark said he was close to understanding what was happening, that he just needed more time. The lieutenant said no, Mark needed to step back, needed to take care of himself, needed to let other detectives handle the investigation. Mark asked what other detectives, and the lieutenant said they were bringing in a task force, that Mark was no longer assigned to any of the connected cases. Mark started to argue and the lieutenant held up his hand and said the decision was final, that Mark could turn in his badge and weapon or he could be escorted out, that those were his only options. Mark turned in his badge and weapon and walked out of the station, and he sat in his car in the parking lot and realized that no one was going to stop this, that no one believed him, that the official investigation would follow conventional methods and find nothing because there was nothing conventional about what was happening. He realized that if he was going to understand the truth, he would have to do it alone, without resources, without authority, without support. He went home and gathered everything he had, all his notes, all his files, all the evidence he had compiled. He spread it out on his living room floor and looked at the pattern, the timeline, the accelerating frequency, and he realized that if the pattern continued there would be another victim within days, and then another, until eventually the pattern would reach him, until eventually he would be the one who disappeared and was found dead and was seen walking around afterward, calm and empty and not himself. He thought about Michelle Carr's journal entry, about the dream of watching herself from outside her body, about someone else wearing her face. He wondered if the victims knew, if they could feel it happening, if they were aware when the substance entered their lungs and took control and pushed their consciousness aside. He wondered if they were still there somewhere, trapped inside their own bodies, watching someone else operate them, or if they were gone completely, erased, replaced. Mark fell asleep on the floor surrounded by his files, and he dreamed that he was in a forest, walking through trees that were too tall and too close together, and the ground beneath his feet was soft and damp and covered with a thick layer of moss. He dreamed that he found a body lying on the ground, posed with its hands folded over its chest, its legs straight, its head tilted slightly to the left, and when he got close enough to see the face he realized it was his own face, realized he was looking at himself, and the body opened its eyes and looked at him and said, "I am you now," and Mark woke up gasping. He checked his phone and saw that it was November 9th, that he had slept for almost 12 hours, that there were 3 missed calls from a number he did not recognize. He called the number back and a woman answered, identifying herself as Detective Sarah Park from the Portland Police Bureau. She said she was part of the task force that had been assigned to the connected murder cases, and she had reviewed Mark's files and she wanted to talk to him. Mark said he was on administrative leave. He was not supposed to be involved in the investigation anymore. Detective Park said she understood that, but she had read Mark's reports and she thought he had found something important, something the task force needed to hear. She asked if they could meet. Mark agreed and they met at a coffee shop, and Detective Park told him that the task force had been investigating for the past week and they had found nothing. No leads, no suspects, no clear motive. She said they were treating the cases as serial murders, but the profile did not fit any known serial killer patterns, and they were running out of ideas. She said she had read Mark's reports about the victims being seen after death and she knew it sounded impossible, but the evidence was compelling, and she wanted to know what Mark thought was happening. Mark told her everything about the surveillance footage, about the witnesses, about the substance in the victims' lungs, about the theory that something was animating the bodies, using them, learning to be them. He expected her to dismiss him, to look at him the way his lieutenant had looked at him, with concern and disbelief, but instead she listened carefully and took notes and asked questions. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had been a detective for 15 years and she had seen a lot of strange things, and she had learned that sometimes the explanation that sounded impossible was the only explanation that fit the evidence. She said the task force had identified 2 new victims in the past week, both of them following the same pattern. Both of them found dead in isolated locations. Both of them seen alive afterward. She said if Mark's theory was correct, if something was taking control of the bodies after death, then they needed to figure out what that something was and where it was coming from and how to stop it before more people died. Mark asked if the task force would support his theory, if they would investigate based on his findings. Detective Park said probably not. They were focused on traditional investigative methods, but she believed him, and she was willing to work with him unofficially to follow up on leads the task force might miss. They started working together, meeting in secret, sharing information, building on Mark's research. Detective Park used her access to police resources to pull additional evidence, to interview witnesses who had seen the victims after death, to analyze the patterns Mark had identified. They discovered that all of the victims had been in Forest Park within 2 weeks of their disappearances, all of them hiking or jogging or walking, all of them in the same general area on the northwest side of the park. They pulled trail camera footage and found images of several victims walking alone on isolated paths, and in the background of some of the images, barely visible, there was something else, a dark shape among the trees, something that did not look quite like a person or an animal, something that was watching. Mark and Detective Park drove to Forest Park and hiked to the area where the victims had been seen. The area was dense with old-growth trees and undergrowth, the ground covered with a thick layer of decomposing leaves and moss. The air was damp and heavy and smelled earthy, like the smell witnesses had described when they encountered the victims after death. Mark and Detective Park walked carefully, looking for anything unusual, and they found it in a small clearing about a mile off the main trail. In the center of the clearing, there was a mass of fungal growth, a cluster of mushrooms and spore structures that covered the ground in a circle about 20 feet in diameter. The growth was pale and fibrous and seemed to pulse slightly, as if it were breathing. Detective Park took photos and collected samples, careful not to touch the growth directly. Mark walked around the perimeter of the circle, looking at the way the fungal mass extended into the soil, the way it seemed to be connected to the roots of the surrounding trees. He remembered what the medical examiner had said, that the substance in the victim's lungs appeared to be networked, connected to itself, forming a web-like structure. He wondered if this was the source, if this was where the substance came from, if the victims had breathed in spores while hiking and the spores had taken root in their lungs and grown and eventually taken control. They left the park and took the samples to a private lab, paying with Mark's credit card because they could not use official resources without raising questions. The lab analyzed the samples and confirmed that the fungal material matched the unknown substance found in the victim's lungs. The lab said the fungal structure was unlike anything in their database, that it appeared to be a complex organism capable of rapid growth and adaptation. They said the spores were extremely small and could be easily inhaled, and once inside a host, the fungus would colonize the respiratory system and spread throughout the body. They said the fungal network appeared to have some kind of intelligence, some capacity for coordination and communication, though they could not explain how or why. Mark and Detective Park went back to Forest Park with protective masks and full body suits and flamethrowers, planning to burn the fungal mass, to destroy it before it could produce more spores and infect more people. But when they reached the clearing, the mass was gone. The ground where it had been was bare, no trace of fungal growth, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Mark and Detective Park searched the area for hours, looking for any sign of where the fungus had gone or where it might have relocated, and they found nothing. That night, Mark received a call from his ex-wife, who he had not spoken to in 2 years. She said she had heard he was having trouble at work, that he had been put on leave, that people were worried about him. Mark said he was fine, he was just dealing with a difficult case. His ex-wife said she wanted to see him to make sure he was okay, to talk about things. Mark said now was not a good time, he was in the middle of something important. His ex-wife said she was already in Portland. She had driven down from Seattle. She was at his apartment waiting for him. Mark drove home and found his ex-wife sitting on his couch, and something about the way she was sitting made him stop in the doorway. She was too still, too composed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and empty. Mark asked her why she was really there, and she said she wanted to see him. She had missed him. She had been thinking about him. Mark asked her when they had last spoken, and she said recently they had talked on the phone. Mark said they had not talked on the phone in 2 years. Not since the divorce was finalized. His ex-wife smiled and said he must be misremembering. They had definitely talked. Mark felt his heart rate accelerate, felt the cold certainty settling into his bones again. He asked his ex-wife to tell him something only she would know, something personal from their marriage. She said they had been married for 8 years. They had lived in a house on the east side. They had gotten a dog named Charlie. All of that was public information. All of that could be found online or in records. Mark asked her to tell him what she had said to him the last time they spoke in person. His ex-wife's smile did not change. She said she did not remember. It had been a long time ago. Mark said it had not been that long, only 2 years, and she had said something specific, something that had made him cry. His ex-wife said maybe he was confused. Maybe he was remembering wrong. Mark backed out of the apartment and locked the door from the outside and ran to his car and drove away. He called Detective Park and told her what had happened, and she said she would meet him at the station, that they needed to figure out what was going on. Mark said he did not think his ex-wife was his ex-wife. He thought something was wearing her, something that looked like her and sounded like her but did not have her memories, did not have her personality. Mark told her everything about the surveillance footage, about the witnesses, about the substance in the victim's lungs, about the theory that something was animating the bodies, using them, learning to be them. He expected her to dismiss him, to look at him the way his lieutenant had looked at him, with concern and disbelief, but instead she listened carefully and took notes and asked questions. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had been a detective for 15 years and she had seen a lot of strange things, and she had learned that sometimes the explanation that sounded impossible was the only explanation that fit the evidence. She said the task force had identified 2 new victims in the past week, both of them following the same pattern. Both of them found dead in isolated locations. Both of them seen alive afterward. She said if Mark's theory was correct, if something was taking control of the bodies after death, then they needed to figure out what that something was and where it was coming from and how to stop it before more people died. Mark asked if the task force would support his theory, if they would investigate based on his findings. Detective Park said probably not. They were focused on traditional investigative methods, but she believed him, and she was willing to work with him unofficially to follow up on leads the task force might miss. They started working together, meeting in secret, sharing information, building on Mark's research. Detective Park used her access to police resources to pull additional evidence, to interview witnesses who had seen the victims after death, to analyze the patterns Mark had identified. They discovered that all of the victims had been in Forest Park within 2 weeks of their disappearances, all of them hiking or jogging or walking, all of them in the same general area on the northwest side of the park. They pulled trail camera footage and found images of several victims walking alone on isolated paths, and in the background of some of the images, barely visible, there was something else, a dark shape among the trees, something that did not look quite like a person or an animal, something that was watching. Mark and Detective Park drove to Forest Park and hiked to the area where the victims had been seen. The area was dense with old-growth trees and undergrowth, the ground covered with a thick layer of decomposing leaves and moss. The air was damp and heavy and smelled earthy, like the smell witnesses had described when they encountered the victims after death. Mark and Detective Park walked carefully, looking for anything unusual, and they found it in a small clearing about a mile off the main trail. In the center of the clearing there was a mass of fungal growth, a cluster of mushrooms and spore structures that covered the ground in a circle about 20 feet in diameter. The growth was pale and fibrous and seemed to pulse slightly, as if it were breathing. Detective Park took photos and collected samples, careful not to touch the growth directly. Mark walked around the perimeter of the circle, looking at the way the fungal mass extended into the soil, the way it seemed to be connected to the roots of the surrounding trees. He remembered what the medical examiner had said, that the substance in the victim's lungs appeared to be networked, connected to itself, forming a web-like structure. He wondered if this was the source, if this was where the substance came from, if the victims had breathed in spores while hiking and the spores had taken root in their lungs and grown and eventually taken control. They left the park and took the samples to a private lab, paying with Mark's credit card because they could not use official resources without raising questions. The lab analyzed the samples and confirmed that the fungal material matched the unknown substance found in the victim's lungs. The lab said the fungal structure was unlike anything in their database, that it appeared to be a complex organism capable of rapid growth and adaptation. They said the spores were extremely small and could be easily inhaled, and once inside a host, the fungus would colonize the respiratory system and spread throughout the body. They said the fungal network appeared to have some kind of intelligence, some capacity for coordination and communication, though they could not explain how or why. Mark and Detective Park went back to Forest Park with protective masks and full body suits and flamethrowers, planning to burn the fungal mass, to destroy it before it could produce more spores and infect more people. But when they reached the clearing, the mass was gone. The ground where it had been was bare, no trace of fungal growth, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Mark and Detective Park searched the area for hours, looking for any sign of where the fungus had gone or where it might have relocated, and they found nothing. That night, Mark received a call from his ex-wife, who he had not spoken to in 2 years. She said she had heard he was having trouble at work, that he had been put on leave, that people were worried about him. Mark said he was fine, he was just dealing with a difficult case. His ex-wife said she wanted to see him to make sure he was okay, to talk about things. Mark said now was not a good time, he was in the middle of something important. His ex-wife said she was already in Portland. She had driven down from Seattle. She was at his apartment waiting for him. Mark drove home and found his ex-wife sitting on his couch, and something about the way she was sitting made him stop in the doorway. She was too still, too composed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and empty. Mark asked her why she was really there, and she said she wanted to see him. She had missed him. She had been thinking about him. Mark asked her when they had last spoken, and she said recently they had talked on the phone. Mark said they had not talked on the phone in 2 years, not since the divorce was finalized. His ex-wife smiled and said he must be misremembering. They had definitely talked. Mark felt his heart rate accelerate, felt the cold certainty settling into his bones again. He asked his ex-wife to tell him something only she would know, something personal from their marriage. She said they had been married for 8 years. They had lived in a house on the east side. They had gotten a dog named Charlie. All of that was public information, all of that could be found online or in records. Mark asked her to tell him what she had said to him the last time they spoke in person. His ex-wife's smile did not change. She said she did not remember. It had been a long time ago. Mark said it had not been that long, only 2 years, and she had said something specific, something that had made him cry. His ex-wife said maybe he was confused. Maybe he was remembering wrong. Mark backed out of the apartment and locked the door from the outside and ran to his car and drove away. He called Detective Park and told her what had happened, and she said she would meet him at the station, that they needed to figure out what was going on. Mark said he did not think his ex-wife was his ex-wife. He thought something was wearing her, something that looked like her and sounded like her but did not have her memories, did not have her personality. Detective Park was coughing, her eyes watering, and Mark knew she had breathed them in too. Knew they were both infected now. Knew it was only a matter of time before the fungus took control and they became like the others, empty and calm and not themselves. They drove to the medical examiner's office and told her what had happened, and the medical examiner examined them and confirmed that they both had trace amounts of the fungal material in their respiratory systems. She said the growth was already beginning, the threads were already forming networks, and there was no treatment, no way to remove it, no way to stop it. She said they had maybe 2 days before the fungus took full control, maybe less. Mark asked what would happen to them, what it would feel like when the fungus took over. The medical examiner said based on what they knew about the other victims, the transition would be gradual. They would start to lose access to their memories. Their personalities would begin to fade. They would start to feel distant from themselves. And eventually they would be gone completely and something else would be operating their bodies. Something that looked like them and sounded like them but was not them at all. Mark and Detective Park sat in the medical examiner's office and tried to decide what to do with the time they had left. Detective Park said she wanted to go home, wanted to see her family one more time, wanted to say goodbye before she was not herself anymore. Mark said he understood, and he drove her to her house and watched her walk inside, and he knew he would never see the real Sarah Park again, that the next time he saw her she would be something else, something wearing her face. Mark drove back to his own apartment and realized he could not go inside, could not face the fungal growth that had taken over his space. He drove to the station instead and sat in the parking lot, and he thought about calling someone, calling his family, calling his friends, calling anyone who might want to know what was happening to him. But he realized there was no one to call, that he had spent so much of his life focused on work that he had let his relationships drift away. that there was no one who would miss him when he was gone. He thought about Sarah Whitmore and David Chun and Michelle Carr and Angela Torres and all the other victims, and he thought about how they had all been normal people living normal lives, and he thought about how the fungus had chosen them at random, had taken them one by one, had replaced them with something that looked like them but was not them, and he thought about how no one had noticed, how people had continued interacting with the replacements as if nothing was wrong, how easy it had been for the fungus to infiltrate human society without being detected. He thought about his ex-wife sitting on his couch with an empty smile, about the way she had said they were everywhere now, they were becoming everyone, and he realized that the fungus was not killing people, it was replacing them, it was slowly taking over the human population one person at a time, and by the time anyone realized what was happening it would be too late. There would be more of them than there were of us, and there would be no way to tell who was real and who was not. Mark could feel the fungus working in his lungs, could feel it spreading through his body, could feel his thoughts becoming slower, more distant, as if he were watching himself from outside. He pulled out his phone and tried to write down everything he knew, everything he had learned, everything that had happened, but his fingers would not move the way he wanted them to, and the words came out wrong, jumbled, incoherent. He tried to call someone, tried to warn someone, but he could not remember any phone numbers, could not remember any names, could not remember why he had wanted to call in the first place. He sat in his car in the parking lot and watched the sun go down, and he felt himself slipping away, felt his personality dissolving, felt his identity breaking apart, and the last coherent thought he had was that he had been right. He had understood what was happening, he had solved the case, but there was no one to tell, no one to warn, no one who would believe him, and soon he would be gone and something else would be wearing his face, something that would walk into the police station and ask to be reinstated and would go back to work investigating homicides, and no one would know the difference, no one would suspect, no one would realize that Detective Mark Ellis was dead and had been dead for days, and whatever was wearing him was not him at all. On November 15th, Detective Mark Ellis returned to duty after his administrative leave. His lieutenant welcomed him back and said he was glad Mark had taken time to rest, that Mark seemed more focused now, more grounded. Mark smiled and said thank you, and his lieutenant did not notice that the smile was a little too calm, a little too empty, or that Mark's breathing was slightly too regular, too measured, or that there was a faint, sweet, earthy smell following him wherever he went. Mark went to his desk and reviewed his case files, and he saw the files about the connected murders, the files about the victims who had been seen after death, and he closed the files and put them away and marked them as inactive, and no one questioned him, no one asked why, because Mark Ellis was a good detective and everyone trusted his judgment. Over the following weeks, Mark worked on new cases, interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, wrote reports, and everything he did was competent and thorough and completely normal. He attended briefings, he collaborated with other detectives, he went to the grocery store and bought food, he went to the gym and worked out, he went home to the apartment he had been assigned after his old apartment had been condemned due to structural issues, and he lived the life that Mark Ellis would have lived if Mark Ellis were still alive. And when people asked him about the strange murder cases he had been investigating, the cases where victims had been seen after death, Mark said those cases had turned out to be dead ends, the witnesses had been mistaken, the evidence had been misinterpreted, there was nothing unusual about them at all. In December, Detective Sarah Park returned to work after taking a few weeks off for personal reasons. In January, Angela Torres was seen again at her apartment building, and when her roommate Lisa asked where she had been for the past 2 months, Angela said she had been right there the whole time. Lisa must have been confused. In February, 3 new missing person cases were reported, and in March the bodies were found, posed with hands folded over their chests, and by April the missing people were seen walking around their neighborhoods, buying coffee, going to work, living their lives like nothing had happened. The pattern continued, accelerating, spreading, and no one noticed because the people who had noticed were gone now, replaced by something that looked like them and sounded like them but was not them, and the something that replaced them made sure that no one else would notice, that no one else would investigate, that no one else would understand what was happening until it was too late, until everyone was replaced, until there was no one left who remembered what it meant to be human.